Chairman Mao, Jamie Howe, Ho Chi Minh, Asif Din, Václav Havel, Graham Saville, No Surrender, Percy Fender, Guerilla Cricket.
Hello, welcome again to Guerillashire. In February this year, just before the world lockdown, I was at the MCG Museum in Melbourne. Lovely old chap showed me around, and he knew absolutely everything you could possibly know about Australian cricket and, of course, the MCG. So we got chatting about Lords and comparisons between the two places. So I asked him, did you know that the only player ever to hit a ball over the Lord's Pavilion was actually from Victoria? He didn't, and he knew nothing about Albert Trott. Well, I recommended he read a book called Over and Out by my guest today, Steve Neal. It was Cricket Writers Club Book of the Year in 2017 and is the remarkable story of a neglected cricket hero. Albert Trott was good enough to play for Australia and England, but at the height of his power, no test team would pick him. He took 8 for 43 on his debut. When he played his last test for them, he had an average of 102.5, and he's perhaps most famous, of course, for his exploits on the 31st of July 1899, when he powered Monty Noble's delivery up and over that Lord's Pavilion. It's a wonderful book on Albert's life, but with a sad and tragic end. Steve, a very, very warm welcome.
Oh, thanks, Tony. Yeah, good to be here.
Yeah, well, delighted to have you with us. And obviously, we're going to talk about the subject of today, Albert Trott, played for Australia and for England, and all of those amazing stats, an incredible story behind him. Let's start, though, if we may, just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background in cricket, and how did you discover Albert?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that. I was originally from Birmingham, so kind of Warwickshire is where my heart is. I'm not a Middlesex man. I have lived in London, kind of visited Lords. I'm now based in Somerset. I'm about a gimlet hit away from the Frome ground, the showground, where the fastest first-class century of the season was made in 1934. So I go across to Taunton, I watch Somerset play. I go up to Bristol for one day and off to Lords and other test grounds.
Well, you clearly have developed an affinity and an understanding of our subject today. Just tell us, give us a little potted summary, and then we'll sort of unpick what is a wonderful, unlikely story about a somewhat charismatic hero that seemed to drop out of everyone's consciousness and cease to be a hero.
Yeah, it's quite interesting what you were saying in the intro about the business of about not being known at the Melbourne Cricket Ground, unknown. Now, in 2010, I was with my youngest son, and he was just off to university, and he said, could we go around, do a tour of the Lord's Ground? So, I joined in and kind of went along with it and really enjoyed it, actually. And then there was the kind of moment where you're sitting in the stand and the tour guide kind of says, well, does anyone know who cleared the Lord Pavilion? And of course, there's, the Indians there say Tendulkar, the Australians say, Bradman, and some, must be W.G. Grace.
I'm not sure it'd be Bradman style, but...
yeah. And you go at that point, you don't want to look like, the man who knows everything. So it's Albert Trott. I said the other interesting thing about Albert Trott was that he had an average of 102.5 in the Ashes. And at this point, there's a South African there, and he kind of turns to me and said, excuse me, sir, are you the author of A Life of Albert Trott? And I said, no, I'm not actually. I'm just kind of interested in him. I've read David Frith's book and things.
Yeah.
Then the idea came to me, perhaps I could be, that person who writes the history of Albert Trott. So eventually I did, get the book out. But it started in the Pavilion, the book did. And, it was good. Yeah, it was good.
Well, it's interesting there. You mentioned the David Frith book, which I think is called A Silence of the Heart.
Yeah.
That has a chapter on Albert. I mean, I haven't, I must confess, read it. But like your homework being on the bus, I genuinely can tell you that it's on its way from Amazon because reading Albert again, your book on Albert made me think about it. I know you'd said that it was reading that book and the chapter about Albert that that kind of drew you to his story. Yeah. Just tell us a little bit more about what it was in there that made you think, this is going to be something that I want to personally write a book about.
I think it was, in one way, he made that kind of fantastic entrance into Test cricket. That he cleared the Pavilion, he came to play for Middlesex and MCC, and then he shot himself, kind of 1914, committed suicide in his lodgings. So it was kind of a very sad story. And what I was interested in was how someone kind of starts out so promising and then it kind of goes wrong bit by bit. And that was what I was interested in. That's what I wanted to find out about. I mean, people say sometimes that the kind of book you should write is the book you want to read. And I wanted to read that story in full. So I ended up trying to find out about it.
You have a wonderful phrase, or it might actually have been Patsy Hendren's that you'd appropriated. It was something about playing cricket or earning his living as a professional cricketer, but playing like a gilded amateur.
I think it's my own, not Patsy, on this occasion.
Well, it's a beautiful line.
Yeah.
So Patsy can't have it. It's definitely yours then.
No, I think that's kind of one of the oddities, really. I mean, Trott was a professional cricketer. He barely did anything else. I think he had a 2-week stint delivering letters in Melbourne as a postman, and that was it. The rest of his life, total professional cricketer. But the way in which he played his game was in a kind of freedom and abandon of, the kind of professional of the golden age in some ways. He didn't kind of, look at his average, look at his figures, think about renewals of contract. He just kind of played for that moment more than anything else. I mean, it's incredible, really. I mean, you look at the amount of games he played for Middlesex and Somerset. And if he ever had a day off, he went off to play club cricket somewhere just because he enjoyed playing so much.
Well, he played, was it 12 years for Middlesex? 98 to 1910, I think, during which Middlesex won one championship in 1903. He bowled a lot with J.T. Hearn, who everyone remembers. Did he go on and then play for Somerset for a bit afterwards?
No, Trott, no, not at all.
No, I didn't think so. No.
No, I mean, once he'd stopped playing, he became an umpire.
Ah, yes, he did. And apparently, as I found out in the book, was not necessarily one of the best umpires. His umpiring perhaps being as idiosyncratic as is his cricket, and it was not best loved by Jack Hobbs, as I recall.
That's right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think it was known, kind of on the circuit that you got a shocker from Albert Trott. I think he gave, I'm sure his concentration wasn't good by that particular point.
Well, yeah, obviously we'll come on to, he's leaving the Middlesex and what was a very sad story of decline. But, I think what really interests me, and you say it yourself, you make a point, I think you actually conclude at the end of the book, he probably doesn't deserve a picture in the Lord's Pavilion, but then your reason for saying that is because in the days of amateurs and professionals, where the professionals were actually of the lower class and the amateurs were more of the gentry, it was just not a place he would have belonged.
No. He was never in there. He was never allowed in there. If you look at the portraits in that period, they are of amateurs. I kind of haven't gone round and done, a thorough inventory of what's there. But, they are largely amateur players. Obviously, times are different now. But, back then, Trott's place was next door with the professionals in the Bowlers' Pavilion.
Yeah. No, indeed. Why do you think... maybe we should start by just reprising some of the stats that people may not necessarily know. Yeah. He played 3 games for Australia, didn't he? 3 tests for Australia, all against England.
Yeah. That's that's interesting in itself. 1894-5 was, a key series in terms of England-Australia. Since the Australians' victory in, I think, 1882, they had only won one series since then. So it was a long period of English dominance. And in that 5-match series in 1894-5, England took a 2-0 lead in the series. And it was Trott who came in for the third match, who kind of turned things round. He took, in that third test, he scored 38 not out in the first inning, 72 not out in the second, and then took 8 for 43 to win the game. And then, after doing that, 8 for 43, they remain the best figures on debut. They remain the best ever figures at Adelaide. I mean, that says something in itself. In the next match at Sydney, he turned that round with a 85 not out. But he didn't even get a bowl in that match, which Australia won.
And his brother at that stage wasn't captain, was he?
Sorry?
Was his brother captain for that game, or did that game later?
It was George Giffen, the captain from Hull. So it was 2-2, and then the third match, Australia lost it, and England took the series. But, kind of Trott came out of it with an incredible amount of credit, how he turned the series round. I mean, in kind of the wider picture was that England team had gone over then at that point because of the banking crisis in Melbourne, financial problems, a crash, and the Melbourne Cricket Club had lost a lot of money. So it was the Melbourne Cricket Club who invited England over to tour. And I think, that series was very much part of what has created the Ashes and put, the kind of England-Australia contest, kind of raised it to that level. I mean, things were flagging at that point in terms of Ashes cricket. So, yeah.
His first wicket was AC McLaren, wasn't it? I mean, if I might
so, yes.
Not a bad scalp to open your career with.
No. It was the English cricketers quite rated him. And in fact, it was McLaren and Stoddart talking at breakfast about how they regard him as the best player that kind of got him in the team, that kind of got him across the line. But he was, 1894, he was 21.
Yeah, just a lad.
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit, perhaps, as well about his family background and what made him the man he was, I suppose, as well as the player he was. Am I right in saying that his great-grandmother came from a slave background and sort of had married her way out of that? So there's always been a hint of something different about his upbringing, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, his grandmother was a slave. When slavery was abolished in the British Empire, 1833, she was kind of released from slavery and married Trott's grandfather. Now, that was in Antigua. By then, kind of with the abolition of slavery, the sugar economy in the Caribbean collapsed. And in a sense, it was kind of hard times. So Trott's father, who was 13, came with his uncle and his grandmother, who had been the slave, on board ship to England, to Bristol, changed at Bristol, emigrated to Australia. And then, so technically, Trott was qualified for West Indies, Australia, and England. He had an English mother. His father married an English woman. So he could have played for all three, really. But, his father married young. Trott was actually, I think, the sixth child, older brothers. But the father, Augustus Trott, was cricket mad and kind of got involved with it fairly early on. And his older brothers, Gus and Harry, they all played, as well as his sister, Anna, played for a women's team as well. So, yeah, cricket mad families.
So he found his way by playing, I think he played for, was it East Melbourne? South Melbourne? It was a district of Melbourne, South Melbourne.
Yeah, and then he played for East Melbourne.
Oh, okay.
They offered him more money.
So there he was. He nearly he's got the world record still the world record as the best figures on debut, 8 for 43. He made 85 not out, I think, in the next game at Sydney, batting at 8 or 9. Although sadly he didn't get to bowl as much, did he? I don't think in that game.
He didn't get bowled at all.
Yeah. And then the series, sadly for Australia, it kind of ultimately was lost 3-2 at Melbourne. But at the time, so here is a young player, big hitter, very useful bowler. I think he bowled off breaks, but could throw them down pretty quick. Am I right in saying?
Yeah, I mean, he bowled. He broke the ball, off breaks. Yeah, but he could also bowl quick as well. He was actually quick enough to get taken off at Lord's for bowling too quick. I mean, he kind of experimented with it at some points. And also, kind of one of his influences, which we may want to talk about, is baseball.
Yes. So tell us a little bit about that, because yes, I'd forgotten, I suppose, that baseball had got quite some traction in Australian history. But he did play that. So yeah, how do you think that affected his game?
Well, I think originally it was regarded as a way of keeping fit. It was played in the winter, and they put on a baseball match before the Australian rules game as a kind of little starter. So I think the main influence on Trott was in terms of his bowling. And he bowled a ball which kind of dipped, and also a kind of curved ball as well. So it was definite influence on his bowling style. And certainly in terms of his fielding, in an era of fairly mediocre fielding. I mean, the Australians, were good fielders, those who played baseball. They kind of benefited from that. I mean,
Yeah. No, you go on.
The other interesting thing about baseball, at one point, the kind of cricket and baseball were fairly closely aligned, and there was talk of Australian cricket teams touring England and then going across to New York, picking up a couple of specialist bowlers and playing baseball in America.
Oh, wow. Did that ever happen?
No, it never actually happened. There was a baseball tour, which was fairly disastrous later on, and Trott ended up kind of picking the pieces and, providing a roof over the head for the players who were broke from playing there. Someone ran off with the money.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that interested me was one of the wonderful things about the book is the level of detail. I mean, you describe him, classily cutting the ball over the chains.
Yes.
And throughout the book, the degree of descriptiveness for games that were in the sort of the late 19th century is extraordinary. So, I mean, one of the questions I'd love to talk with you about is the level of research and you must have gone through to write about a game literally almost as though it was one. You could have been discussing yesterday's ODI between England and Australia. It seemed that recent. How did you do that?
It's quite funny, really. Bob Willis, late Bob Willis, was talking to me about the book. He says one of the things he liked was the research. And I said, well, actually, Bob, I thought I'd gone a bit light on that, And he kind of gave me that Bob Willis laugh, which I'll always, remember. But, I mean, I think there's different types of research. There's one that's a kind of general background. I like to get the feel of things. So I read a lot of newspapers, Australian and English from that period, which I quite enjoyed doing. And that gives you the kind of flavour of what people thought and felt and things. But the other kind of research I quite like, which is a very specific research, where you're looking to answer a question, a specific thing, and you want the answer to this question. And the answer to the question that I wanted was, how did he come to leave Middlesex towards the end? And I was kind of in the Lord's Library, who are absolutely fantastic, and they dug out all these old minutes from meetings and things like this, and I'm there kind of looking at it. And I think I actually said, like that, that kind of moment when I found out.
Well, they paid him off in the end, didn't they? Hadn't they invested some money in the East India Company, and they got some of that back, and that was it. He was gone.
I think, Indian Railway stock. Yeah. It was that line that says, They agreed to give him the rest of his money as long as he agreed never to have anything to do with the club again. It was quite, go away. We've had enough, really. But it was just interesting to find that in print, recorded in the minutes. Yeah.
Well, that's okay. So he's burst onto the scene. He's taken 8 for 43. He's followed that up with an 85 not out. He's played 3 matches. Sadly, Australia didn't win the series. He's got a batting average of 102.5. They're picking the tour that is then the team for the tour that's then going to get on the boat, and as they did, of course, in those days, and sail to England. Everyone seemed in the local Australian press and beyond to assume he was a shoo-in. Even the England players respected him in so much, as you pointed out, that they thought they were making his case. And he didn't make that tour. And a tour, by the way, that his brother was on and I think was part of selecting the team for. So how come?
Yeah, I mean, his brother wasn't actually a selector on the team. What happened was there was the 3 main states at that particular point were South Australia, New South Wales and Victoria. And so a member from each of those made up the selection committee, including George Giffen. They found a very odd method of selecting, in they selected the batsmen, the bowlers, and people who might do a bit of both at the end.
Right.
And the touring parties only had 13 in them, 13 players. I mean, that's a full Summers tour of England. So Trott wasn't selected. They regarded him as someone who could do a bit of both. But by then, they picked 2 fast bowlers. They were told by Billy Murdoch, an Australian living in England, that they needed pacemen. They needed something a bit different if they're going to beat England. And in fact, Albert Trott, for a while, experimented with the idea of becoming a fast bowler. But I mean, he wasn't, quite there. So in the end, they picked 2 fast bowlers, Ernie Jones and Charles Eady, and not Albert Trott. There was an absolute outcry. He got a lot of supporters from former players, from his own club in East Melbourne, and it kind of went on, for months and months and months. The kind of arguments about whether he should go or not. At that point, he'd been offered a contract to qualify for Middlesex through a man called Jim Phillips, who played for Middlesex and was a kind of cricketing entrepreneur of the time. And he said, well, if Australia doesn't want you, Middlesex will want you. You can qualify and play for the MCC. However, before he got there, there was an agreement that said, well, maybe we could do with Albert Trott after all. So he could be the 14th man. So we went on the boat with the Australian team as if he was a member of the party. And he actually played with that touring team in Colombo in 1896. But when he got to England, he was kind of in trouble, really, because he wasn't a member of the touring party. And the touring parties at those times operated, I think, as Gideon Hager said, like limited companies. So there were a manager, there was 13 players, all the receipts were divided up equally, except if you were a younger player, you might be on a slightly reduced share and things. So they weren't going to divide it up anymore, just on the chance that he might be called upon. So he went across to Lords and spent the summer there. And Australia didn't call on him, and that was his kind of end of his association with them.
Well, yeah, actually, that's one of the interesting things that comes out in the book, the commercial nature of how tours were organised in the early days of Test cricket. And there's certainly a few stories in there of ways that extra money could be made, and the arguments over about how the money was shared. But he's on the boat to England. He needs to qualify to play for Middlesex. But then it's against Australia, or an Australian team, pretty much the full Australian team, I think. Isn't he playing for the Middlesex and Ground? And it's the 31st of July, 1899, when he probably wrote his most famous line in history, despite everything that we've been discussing. Tell us a little bit about that day and what happened.
Well, Australian touring team were over. The captain was Joe Darling, and Trott was highly rated in England. That season, he took 200 wickets and 1,000 runs. The first player to do that. That was and he did it again in 1900. So he did it 2 years running. But the Australians didn't rate him. And they kind of had this campaign, and they were kind of saying things like, he may be good enough for you, but, we know all his tricks, Gets away with it. He's never getting out. He's not good enough to play for us. And there was a background of that also.
Do you think the support of England, in a way, espousing him, actually worked against him in terms of playing again for Australia?
Yeah. I mean, there's that kind of odd thing of people who are neither one thing or another. Who kind of set down the cracks of nationality, the Anglo-Australian. I think David Frith mentioned that recently. He talked about the anguish of the Anglo-Australian. So he's kind of too English to be Australian, too Australian to be English. So he falls into that kind of peculiar category there. But yeah, so they didn't like him particularly. And when he came to Lords, he was up against Monty Noble, who came on to bowl. Now, Monty Noble was the same age as Trott. And when Trott had been doing his 8 for 43, Noble was playing for Sydney Juniors. So there was, in a sense, that Noble had kind of come in and taken his place in the team. So when he came on to bowl, he bowled in a kind of similar style to Trott. So he had a go, and he just went after it. I mean, there were a couple of biggish hits before that. One that went into the main pavilion, one into the professionals' little pavilion on the side. But it was his last kind of hit at it, went up and hit the chimney, the right-hand chimney, and fell into one of the dressing room attendants' gardens at the back.
Somebody, yeah. I can't remember the name of it.
He didn't get 6 for it because he didn't go out of the ground. He had to go clean out the ground to get 6 at that. He only got 4 for it, so it's always... Is
it the most famous 4 ever struck? It has to be right up there, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And just to be clear, this was the Thomas Verity Pavilion that we know today.
Yes.
So in terms of height and distance, because I know other players have tried it. I seem to recall in 2016 you had the likes of Owen Morgan and a few professionals going, well, I'll give this a go, facing a bowling machine for hours, and none of them could get close.
Yeah. I mean, it is difficult. I mean, there's players like, was it Michael Llewellyn from Glamorgan?
Yeah.
And a few others, I think, who've got into the third tier, kind of towards the top. But he actually made bigger hits than that, which hit... there's that MCC crest on one of the towers. Yeah. He got that once, which was higher than the chimney. So he did that.
Well, he sort of warmed up, didn't he? Didn't he come close against Sussex as well, and was just beaten by hitting something that stopped the ball going all the way?
Yes, yeah. I mean, he'd done it a few times. I mean, he'd kind of been close. I mean, he was also only the second ever person to hit the ball out of the ground at Trent Bridge.
Wow. Which he must have got 6 then.
Yes, he did get 6 for that one, yeah. But, I mean, there's certainly a lot of power in Trott. I mean, one of the ones I always like about him is his drives. The Australians call them carpet drives, They still do today. It's Shane Warne commentating because all along the carpet, like that.
Yeah.
It's so hard, kind of drove it, perfectly. It hit the rails in front of the pavilion and came back onto the actual wicket. So it hit it and came back. That's how hard it hit it. There was a lot of genuine power there.
But I think it's kind of interesting if you think about him and his career, because I rather think here's the question then, I guess, is without that hit, even though he was a really interesting character, even though he had those amazing figures and still the best ever debut figures in a test match anywhere, even though he had the phenomenal history, career with Middlesex, even though he played for both teams and did pretty well, I think, when England went to South Africa. The book and the story really wouldn't exist, would it, without that one moment that happened on that day?
No. Yeah, I mean, when he arrived at Lord's, apparently he looked at the Pavilion. The Pavilion was built, I think, 1890, 91, something like that. And he looked at it and said, I'm going to hit the ball over there. Apparently, that's what was said. But that Pavilion, it's an incredible building now. And then the actual size of it, the grandness of it, the kind of theatre for watching cricket. It's a statement. It's a statement about power. It's about who controls cricket. It's about the club. It's about everything, And then you've got Trott's place, which is that little Players Pavilion stuck on the side. But,
is that the bowler's bar now? Am I right?
Yeah, it is.
Where they ring the bell. So if you're picturing Lord's, as most people, any cricket fan would be able to do, the bowler's bar to the side was the old professionals pavilion.
Yes,
am I right?
yes.
Yeah, where Albert would have hung out when he wasn't batting or fielding. And the ball, which you say hit a chimney, would it be the Harris Garden now that it kind of finally found its home in after its journey?
I think so. Yes. I think so.
Extraordinary. So he did this. Did his career perhaps, do you think, Steve, suffer a little bit because having defined it in that moment, perhaps a school of thought he was always trying to replicate that, and that kind of sometimes worked against his effectiveness as a player?
Very much, I think. Yeah. That Sammy Woods, another Anglo-Australian, always said he kind of ruined it by trying to repeat it as often as possible. He just went for it all the time. It's that kind of amateur thing in a way. I'm going to do it for the glory. I want to do it again. I'm going to do it cleanly without hitting the chimney this time. And he just went for it, but found it. Couldn't do it. No one's been able to do it. But there were other close attempts after that. Yeah, he went close.
Somehow, the romantic in me wants it never to be done.
Yes,
because somehow Albert who disappeared into he'd been sort of somewhat forgotten, very sadly, has been rediscovered, courtesy, to a large extent of your help and your fabulous book. If it was done again, he might just recede again once more into sort of anonymity, and I don't think we want that for him. Tell us a little bit about Albert the man. It's really interesting reading the book. You sort of slightly fall in love with him, but you can see, I think, a bit of a flawed personality. I think he was described as quite simple. Who was it? Plum Warner described the perversity of genius, but there's other kind of crazy stories about him, like rolling up paper and spitting pellets at players, or taking a hairbrush to somebody. There's a quirkiness, or if one's being kind, about him that suggests he was an unusual character, to say the least. Can you tell us a little bit more about him? What made him what he was?
I think, in terms of formal education, he didn't go to school much. He always described his school days as, I was one of the rowdy boys, which kind of fits in perfectly with everything that follows. So, he was kind of the natural rebel. He wasn't, I think, what he wasn't very good at was doing what was required of him. Somebody said in his obituary that he was good at cricket, but he wasn't any good at the business of cricket.
Yeah.
So he couldn't quite work out how you had to play the system. Other Middlesex professionals and MCC professionals were good. Someone like Tarrant understood that you had to. He worked in Starman, one of the Middlesex members. He worked in the office in the winter. But someone like Trott never ever did. He never found a way of sustaining a kind of regular income. And he was quite, wild in that sense. The kind of occasion I remember most is kind of 1899, when he was just about to leave for the tour of South Africa. and thought he'd have a night out in Wilson with his mates, you know. And there's a low bunch of them, you know, it's 12 o'clock. And they're walking so many abreast down the street, you know, and they're making a great noise, you know, and the policeman stops them, you know. And Trott, you know, he's sarcastic and he says something. And of course, it's all up in court. So 7 days before he's due to go to South Africa, there he is on court, well-dressed, looking older than his years, but, you know, guilty and, you know, fined for, you know, not acting in the kind of right way that was expected of a professional cricketer.
Well, clearly he was fond of a drink, and sadly that I fear contributed, you know, towards his decline. I don't think fidelity was his strong suit. Didn't he have a lady friend in Somerset for every time Middlesex played there? Once he got caught out, having disappeared and nearly didn't make it to the pitch. That was said. I mean, that's kind of a rumour thing. I mean, there's also one of the story that's floated that he was questioned by the police about the murder of a woman. Yeah.
Taunton about the murder of a prostitute. But, I mean, I kind of investigated that quite fully. And, you know, there's no evidence of a murder in Taunton at that time of anyone, you know, much less, you know, a prostitute. I mean, David Foote investigated it quite fully as well. And he was never able to find any evidence other than the word of the Somerset.
So he was just kind of the personality that urban myths might grow up around, because he was sort of had that larger than life quality, I think. Yes.
People told stories about him because, he was that kind of character, eccentric.
So I guess there's a question that is always interesting, is if he's larger than life, he can hit a massive ball, he can bowl well enough to take 8 for 43 for Australia. On his bad days, he was very bad. On his good days, and he did have a few, even after he was ill, and, you know, I think he still had a few, you know, reminders of what he could be like. If you could have a level playing field and he was walking out at Lord's today, how would he go?
I mean, there's kind of one theory that says, if you look at kind of modern fitness, I mean, drinking amongst players has virtually stopped these days. I mean, very few do it. I mean, the days of a tray of drinks at the end of the day, you know, high nutrition drinks and things like that come out. So kind of with modern training methods, I mean, the kind of argument would be that he kind of would be tamed, that if you look at the different formats, Test, 50 over, T20, he would be particularly good in the shorter forms of the game, because the way in which he bowled, I mean, he got that fast ball which he could deliver, and it was the loss of that fast ball which kind of contributed to his decline as a bowler. I mean, he bowled, so he could be very successful. That would be the argument. I think, on the other hand, I mean, Albert Trott, he would have kind of run into trouble somewhere along the way. There would have been, you know, some kind of incident that happened. You know, he would have, you know, things do go wrong for some people. So I think, really, he might have had a kind of Collis King type Test career, you know, where he plays this kind of amazing innings and he does that. And then I think, you know, he probably ends up playing somewhere in, you know, an obscure Middle Eastern 10-over league. Sort of as the big name signing, you know, and kind of disappoints because he slips off somewhere and doesn't complete the contract.
Well, when I was thinking about this, I was trying to think, were there players in our history, you and me, I guess we're similar-ish ages probably, who he might equate to. I mean, I think I'd listed Botham. George Best, I'd even stepped outside of the world of cricket. And, you know, the phrase flawed genius comes to mind. Yeah. So it sounds like you kind of feel that he would entertain, but even today not realise his full potential, because there was an inherent tendency to go off the rails a bit. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah. But I mean, you know, there's kind of elements of luck. I mean, if you look at someone like Botham, I mean, in terms of the kind of lifestyle in the 70s and 80s. But now he's kind of surreal, Botham. He's very much an establishment figure.
Yeah, no.
I think the other interesting parallel with Botham is actually the bowling. If you think of some of Botham's bowling, where he kind of conned the batsman out,
yeah.
You think that style of
the ability to take wickets with rubbish balls, yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
occasionally.
Same thing, yeah. I mean, similar with Trott, I think, in that kind of way. So there's similarities there. But nowadays, there's kind of more opportunities outside the game than there were then. So, yeah, I mean, commentating, media, that kind of thing, books, agents, all that sort of stuff. A decent player can, make a good living from it.
I think it was, again, Plum Warner who described him rather unkindly as none too bright. I think perhaps that was a little harsh, given everything that we've said about him, and probably Plum's background might have encouraged him to said that about a few people.
Yeah.
Do you think that's unkind and unfair from what you know of Albert?
I mean, he certainly wasn't educated, but he's kind of, as a person, he was what he was like as a player. I mean, that was, that's the kind of important thing, what he was like on the field. I mean, when we watch sport, we kind of watch it for the unexpected, what's going to happen. We kind of construct our own narrative and things, but we want to be surprised. And like whenever Trott comes out, you want to see what happens. I mean, that's the kind of important thing. I mean, intelligence, perhaps, that doesn't matter so much, in kind of the formal sense. I mean, you think of someone like Andrew Simons.
Yes.
I mean, you can point to a certain amount of parallels there, in disappearing to go off on a bender to, playing very aggressively.
Flintoff, there's a few names that you could suddenly put into that category from certainly from cricket and from a number of sports. But whilst he was obviously here, off he went to play for England in South Africa. So he'd qualified for residency here, even obviously being Australian, as you'd pointed out. How did he go on those tours? And obviously, strangely, they weren't tests at the time, but retrospectively became tests. Hence, he's got a test record for both Australia and England. Tell us a little bit about how he came to go to South Africa and how they came to be tests.
I mean, originally, these kind of tours for South Africa were got up by, Lord Hawke's tour to South Africa. It wasn't an England tour to South Africa. And the idea was that you went out there, picked up some nice presents, diamonds, that kind of thing, spot of good dinners, met people. There's a kind of socialisation, being very kind of sociable and enjoying those kind of benefits. But in terms of the cricket, I mean, South African cricket was only just developing at that stage. I mean, it gradually grew stronger over the next decade. So there was a kind of imperial vision, part of the MCC was like going out to these places and taking a team. And there were the amateurs who did the batting and the pros who did the bowling. And so, I mean, that team that went to South Africa in 1899 was fairly strong. I mean, you could pass muster as a test team. But at the time, it was Lord Hawke's 11 against the South Africans. So it was only later, I can't remember the exact date, when they were given status, some of these matches, as tests and kind of went on people's record. So when he was selected for it, it wasn't a question of, oh no, now he's playing for England. It was, he's going on a tour to South Africa with Lord Hawke.
Well, I mean, let's just put into perspective a second. Again, if I'm right, he got 4 for 61, 5 for 49, 4 for 69, and 4 for 19 in a couple of tests at the Old Wanderers and Newlands. Okay, it wasn't the strongest South African team in the world, but you're also talking about a man, therefore, who's taken 3 was 12, 17 England wickets at next to not very many runs at all.
Yes, yeah.
It's not a bad record.
No.
So he can drink a bit. He womanizes a bit. He did have a wife and children over here. His way of making money through being a professional with Middlesex was sort of rather unceremoniously ended and paid off with the rather threatening line that you mentioned earlier, which was, providing he doesn't ever sort of come back again.
Yeah.
Tell us then, because after that, although he did some umpiring, he was not a well man, was he? A combination of alcohol and dropsy. I mean, there's one horrible line you have when it describes him being drained of about 1.5 gallons of fluid. So, and ultimately, it does come to a very sad end. Just tell us a little bit about, the latter years and how that all came about for him.
Yeah, I mean, he was awarded a benefit in 1907, and it was traditional for the benefit to be, I think, round about the bank holiday Monday at Lord's, and it was against Somerset, so he was granted that game as a benefit. MCC were kind of quite strict about collection of monies at benefits. You could collect on the gate, but you couldn't go around the ground to collect. So it was quite, other grounds were kind of different. I mean, the Yorkshire benefits were kind of very well organised. W.G. Grace, the amateur who made so much money from the game, his benefit was superbly organised. He made, I think it was around about 10,000 off it. But Trott struggled in terms of the amount of money he made from that. It was his benefit game. He hadn't had a great season. He wasn't in good condition. And then, of course, in the second innings against Somerset, he takes a double hat-trick. So it's the first occasion that anyone had taken a double hat-trick in a first-class match. And so the game ended early. I mean, the kind of response by professionals in these situations was always, I've bowled myself into the poorhouse. But the fact was, he hadn't lost a considerable amount of money through winning the game. It was just there was kind of low attendance, temperatures weren't that good, lowish crowd, and it ended up with Middlesex making up his money to 300 for it, which wasn't a vast amount.
Now, do you think Middlesex did all right by him in the end?
In the end, so, I mean, they paid for things like doctor's bills early on, but once he'd had all of his benefit money, and he kept on coming back. I suspect what he'd done is remortgage his house, and he needed the money to pay for that. So he kept on coming back, and all of his benefit had pretty much gone, I think, by 1910, which was the idea was to kind of set him up for a while. So he kind of lost that. He was in ill health. I mean, he was kind of involved in all kinds of strange money-making schemes. I mean, people talk about the 100. I mean, Trott played four-a-side against Surrey at the Coliseum, on stage. So, the game, he kind of took up Vigoro, the new cross between lawn tennis and cricket, to find a new market.
Was he naive? Was there a certain naivety about him, or was he just magnificently enthusiastic for kind of any new idea?
Just like new ideas, just doing things, just kind of throwing himself in. But he was, short of money all the way through. I mean, the ball with which he was presented with the ball, which kind of went over the Pavilion. 3 weeks later, it was on sale in a sports shop. In the Strand, this is the ball that Trott, he'd sold it, kind of like that. So he's very much hand to mouth. I mean, they were paid absolute pittance, professionals. So, I mean, there was kind of a couple of possibilities. One was running a pub, becoming a landlord for the professional. Well, bad move. That wasn't.
Yeah, I could see how that wouldn't be good.
Yeah. The other one was coaching at a school, and he wasn't. He did have a coaching spell in New Zealand, but he wasn't a natural coach at all. I mean, he just didn't. He was quite happy to help people in the nets, kind of thing. But in terms of system regularity, it didn't suit. So he ended up becoming an umpire, and it was that when he was, that was his main source of income towards the end. But the other problem was his wife left him and took the two girls to Australia. And it may have been that he was going to follow them at some later point. That, this was a move. You can't support all of us. So he lost the house, and then moved into lodgings. And that it was kind of those difficult last years when he was in and out of hospital, and not able to get a regular income.
And then he in the end, he shot himself, and didn't he leave a very small amount of money to his landlady?
It was £4, I think, to his landlady to cover his bill, and some photos to a friend in Australia. But that was it. I mean, he'd been ill, and he had one prescription to kind of get him through the night. I mean, it must have been some kind of morphine based, but the chemist refused to give him another one. Prescribe another. So, he was in kind of considerable pain and things. I mean, he discharged himself from hospital a couple of days before he died. He borrowed the money from the cab fare home from a hospital orderly, and got there. And went back. And I think he just had enough. And it was around about 2:00 in the afternoon. He was in ill health. He got no money. He got a gun. He was a member of the gun club. And, he shot himself.
Do you think today, with a greater sensitivity and awareness to this kind of mental health and mental issues, do you think he might have been saved and lived a longer, fuller life? I think so. I mean, in the kind of Edwardian period, I mean, one of the prime virtues that was held up was the kind of stoicism, that you don't complain when things are bad, that you show that you can, not to admit weakness, to put, to keep, the stiff upper lip, the brave face. It was all there. He found that difficult. And I think today, people are much more kind of aware of that kind of thing. You look at the work of the Professional Cricketers Association. People keep an eye on that, people's mental health. So, plus the fact there was no kind of welfare state supportive structure to pick up on him at that particular point. You had to really rely on your own resources, what you'd accumulated. And some professionals were very good at it. People like Tarrant, people like Jack Hearn, he was eventually invited onto the Middlesex Committee, Len Braun, Trott's drinking partner. He was eventually became a member of the MCC, but, kind of had a successful post-playing career. But Trott, he just never done anything else. He was stuck. Well, there are many, many wonderful stories. The matches he played in just magnificently brought to life. Personal stories that sort of paint a very full picture of him in the book, which I would encourage anyone to read because it's such a fascinating story. Steve, if again, the wonderful world of hypothesis, if in some alternate universe you're walking into a pub or down the street and you bump into Albert, what would you want to say to him? How would you greet him? And you've got a couple of minutes in his company. What would you say? What would you say to him?
I'd be tongue-tied. I'd just sit there. What would I say to him? Well, I wouldn't say, where did it all go wrong? I would not say that. That kind of...
That's good.
I would not say that at all. I'd say, come on, tell us how you did it. Explain, take us through it bit by bit. So what? By all
accounts, you'd be quite happy to do that.
At length. Whether it would be accurate would be another matter. But, I'd take him through. I'd want to talk about his 8 for 43 when he hit it over the pavilion. Yeah. I'd like to talk mainly about I'd be interested in his kind of relations with the amateurs at Middlesex. That kind of worked, now he felt about that. So I'd like to ask him about that. And I'd like to ask him, a little bit about, see if he'd offer stories on, what he actually got up to. One question I really would like to know. When he qualified for Middlesex in 1898, he was playing at Cambridge University with a Middlesex team, just getting ready for the full county season. And suddenly he's out for several weeks when he injures himself with a table knife. Oh. Now, I don't know, how do you have a major injury with a table knife? I've no idea. So I'd say, what happened? Was it really the table knife, Albert, or what? You know. But yeah, most of all, I'd want to talk about the cricket, you know, rather than the sadder times and things. But yeah.
Well, I suspect if I was able to ask him the same question, he'd probably be thanking you for turning his, it was really taking away his anonymity and creating, recreating his story.
Yeah.
Just in such a fantastic way.
No, I'm pleased you like the book. Yeah, no, it's great.
It has been an absolute pleasure. So what we have been discussing, I always try and hold books up to cameras and they never work, but is the book Over and Out, Albert Trott, the Man Who Cleared the Lord's Pavilion by Steve Neal. It's the incredible story of a man who became almost forgotten, who had taken 8 for 43 on his Test debut, had an average for Australia of 102.5. He was one of only 2 players ever to take 2 first-class hat-tricks in the same innings. He played 12 years for Middlesex, and as Steve was saying at the end there, had kind of written into the story as an extraordinary psychological exploration of a fascinating man playing cricket at a socially very interesting time. It's all explored in the book. It's not a new book. It's been around for a while, but if you haven't heard of it, if you haven't read it, I can only say it is an extremely rewarding read. Steve, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to find out more about Albert in your company.
No, thanks, Tony. No, I've enjoyed talking about it. Yeah.
All right. Of course, this podcast is going to be available in all the normal places. You'll find it on Podbean if you become, and iTunes. If you become a Patreon for Guerrilla Cricket, then you'll get it first and fastest before other folks do. We thank you for listening, and we will, of course, be back with you soon. Take care, everybody.
Guerrilla Cricket.